So the outbreak of the corona pandemic earlier this year has certainly brought to the fore several gaps in our understanding of health, wellness, and also prevention. It has the potential to disrupt the standard norms of prevention and treatment. And as a result, it is expected to have a significant impact on the healthcare industry as a whole. And as with all companies at the moment, healthcare companies are fearful of the economic impact to come, especially with regards to a potential lag in the effects of COVID-19. So during this webinar, we will look at how the healthcare and pharma industries are currently being impacted by the pandemic and what the future looks like for the industry. We are also going to showcase how and where to find healthcare-related information in our ICON product to assist you to do your own analysis as well on this industry. So just we had a quick look. Let me just get this up. There we go. So we had a quick look at the key topics that Refinitiv clients searched for in 2020. And as you can see from this graph, it certainly shouldn't come as a surprise that health and medicine, infectious diseases, China, and coronavirus rose to the top of the chart versus last year, November. We also had a look at the number of users accessing healthcare companies real time or historical stock prices or any news articles tagged to them on ICON, and this was the result that you can see on the screen at the moment. So you see that the interest in certain of these healthcare companies have increased significantly from March until now, looking at those trend lines. So I think certainly no surprises in this information, but it's still interesting to see where the interest lies at the moment. I would just like to welcome our panelists to today's webinar. Joining us, we have Dr. Sanjeev Talwar, who is a senior research analyst and portfolio manager at Invesco Oppenheimer Funds. Sanjeev is responsible for global investments in healthcare and the life sciences industry for Invesco's global equity strategy. We also have David Eckford, who is MBA partner at DRG Consulting. DRG is part of Clarivate and is a premier provider of healthcare analytics data and insight products and services. And David has experience across a broad range of therapeutic areas, including oncology, cardiology, and hospital-based products. And last but not least, we have Sean Stillman, who is a senior product manager at Refinitiv, focused on research and portfolio management workflows. Right, so we're going to start off with a group discussion, and Sean will also show us how to navigate this data on ICON. We will then round off with some questions from the audience. So as I said earlier on, please do not hesitate. If you have any questions, post them, and we will certainly try to get to them before the end of the session. But before we actually start with the formal agenda, we have two polling questions which we would like you to answer so that the panelists can just get a bit of a better sense of who actually is making up the audience today. So we're going to go to the first polling question now. And essentially, we would like to know, what type of company do you work for? An asset manager or asset owner, hedge fund, stockbroker, bank, corporate, or other. So I'll give the audience a couple of seconds just to answer that. You can actually just click on your screen and the answer will register. So just again, what company do you work for? An asset manager or asset owner, a hedge fund, a stockbroker, a bank, a corporate, or any other. Okay, let's see what the results look like. There we go. So 35%, or almost 36%, comes from asset manager or asset owner. Then the next one is banks at about 20%. We also have some corporates and other make up the audience. We have no brokers here today, no stockbrokers, and we have about 7 or 8% from hedge funds. Right, our next question. We would like to know what your main area of focus is. Are you a healthcare or a pharma analyst or portfolio manager? Is your role more of a generalist role? Are you maybe an economist or a strategist or other? Once again, I'll give everyone a few seconds just to answer that. Just again, your main area of focus, is it healthcare or pharma? From an analytical or portfolio management perspective, a generalist, economist or strategist or other? Right, let's go to the results. Okay, a lot of generalists, other also quite big, and then economists and strategists making up about 24%, and about 12% very specialized healthcare pharma audience. Good. So panelists, that's what your audience looks like. And with that, we'll jump into the first question. So, right, so I would like to know the first question: how is the healthcare and pharma industry and stocks currently being impacted by the pandemic? And Sanjeev, I'd like to start off with you just to give us your view from a company or industry, research perspective.
Yeah, well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon. I am sitting in New York, so very much a U.S. perspective in some respects. The short answer sort of is that different areas of healthcare have been impacted quite differently. And just to maybe align all of us, I'll sort of say that healthcare is a collection of several different sectors, each of which can have different drivers for growth and profitability. And at a high level, these include, let's say, biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, an area called life science tools, then medical devices, medical technology, and insurance and hospitals, broadly speaking. And what we've seen is quite a different impact across these different sectors. I'll speak a little bit about the sort of sectors that have done well, perhaps the three of them. One of them, first one is biotechnology, quite broadly. But, in particular, and obviously the companies that are focusing on developing and producing vaccines. Maybe the next one is life science tools, which is a group of companies that supplies the building blocks for discovery and sort of development. And here in particular, the companies that are involved in diagnostic and testing, and some of them, that are involved in production of biologics. And then finally, medical technology. In particular, the companies that are now being involved in the virtualization of healthcare, as I call it. This includes telemedicine or telehealth or remote patient monitoring. And then by contrast, there are a couple of sectors that I think have been particularly hard hit, although some of them are recovering now. The first is medical devices, not all of them, but certain pockets that focus on products used for elective procedures and surgeries. For example, joint replacements, and these kind of procedures can often be delayed or put off. Not all the time, but we've certainly seen that for at least a full quarter. And then hospitals have been hard hit, at least in the US, for the same reasons. Much of the profitable procedures have been put on hold, and so a large loss for the year. But, as we speak, there's a lot of pent-up demand, and sort of more surgeons are going back to work quite frenetically. Okay, so let me just stop there and sort of hand it back.
Thank you, Sanjeev. I'm gonna go to David next, and just ask, David, what are you seeing in this regard on your side?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a strategy consultant. My primary clients are pharma companies, biotech companies. So I absolutely agree with everything Sanjeev has said on regarding some of those other sectors. I mean, we've seen a lot of the same types of impacts, but I'm going to focus a little bit more specifically on pharma companies and biotech companies, relate some of the experiences of my clients. So, talk about pharma generally. I think we'll talk about some of the smaller biotech companies that have really big opportunities with the vaccine later. But as a rule, the pharma companies have actually done pretty well. It has created some headwinds, as Sanjeev touched on some of them. So some of our clients have been, talking to us about forecasting the impact on their key franchises of COVID. But for the most part, I think any of the headwinds have been pretty short-term in nature. And so, as Sanjeev mentioned, elective procedures, physician office closures have resulted in kind of a relatively short-term impact on any kind of drugs that require office administration or drugs that are maybe used in conjunction with some of those elective procedures, and those have been substantially impacted. It's, you may have seen, perhaps ironically, GSK saw a slump in its vaccination business, for example, as a result of some of those factors. But we do expect this to rebound as offices reopen, and there may be a temporary kind of catch-up boost. I think as a whole, we've seen some relatively positive results. I think we saw some positive results from AstraZeneca today. And so some of these factors have been, probably short-term in nature, and overall the pharma industry is pretty healthy. Going forward, I think there could be some positive and negative factors coming out of COVID. I'm a little bit worried about access in the US. As you may know, access to healthcare in the US isn't quite as strong as in some other countries. It's driven a lot by employment, and with higher unemployment, I'm concerned that could drive people away from the commercial insurance plans that are more generous, and towards some of the public insurance, which is obviously less generous. On the other hand, I think there are some long-term positive factors. I think we have seen some improvements in compliance rates as people spend more time at home and rely maybe more on mail order than pharmacy visits. So overall, I think the sector has relatively fewer headwinds than other sectors beyond healthcare, and that COVID obviously will provide a substantial opportunity both for vaccines and treatments. And I think that one nice thing is I think it casts the sector in a relatively positive light. I think we've seen a lot of vilification of the pharma industry in recent years, and it's actually nice to see that, I think people are thinking about this in a more positive light now that there are these opportunities to produce vaccines quickly and treatments and so on. And I think that could be a positive as the battle over drug pricing, for example, heats up again. I think, so for me, really the only concern is what's going to happen with the economy. How is that going to impact healthcare spend? Are we going to be able to continue to afford, the amount of money that we spend on healthcare going forward in a scenario where if the economy continues to suffer? So that's probably the one dynamic that concerns me the most. But otherwise, certainly pharma industry in relatively good shape compared to many other sectors.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, David, for that answer, and Sanjeev. I'm going to move on to Sean next. So, Sean, can you please show us then where in ICON we can actually find information that can be used to analyze the impact on the healthcare industry at the moment?
Sure. So there's a bunch of apps within ICON that are going to confirm the data that both Sanjeev and David just spoke about. So first off, I want to show here, this is the industry overview. The industry overview is a great starting point to dig into industries. You can dig in at a certain country level, and you can dig down to multiple levels of that industry. So right now on my screen, you're seeing the pharmaceuticals and medical research industry. I have it up for Europe, and you're seeing that as we saw, and I have it compared to different market indexes or indices. What you're seeing is that there was the same dip in the industry in terms of pricing year to date back in March, but you're seeing that it did recover faster than the rest of the market, and has continued to recover, and is now actually up more year to date than it was prior to March. So we have seen a faster recovery in what our data is showing in the pharmaceuticals and medical research industry versus the broad market. Another app to show that I always find powerful in explaining industry trends and what's going on is the earnings season app. So earnings season's kicking off. We're probably halfway through right now. In the medical space, the pharmaceutical space, it's still a little bit slow to start. Not that many companies have reported, but what we are seeing right now in terms of companies reporting is we're seeing a very much companies are beating their expectations. So what it looks like is that analysts might have adjusted their values a little bit too much back in March when this began, and these companies are now coming out and they are beating expectations pretty handedly. So here's the U.S. market. You're seeing that 8 of the companies, the major companies, have reported, and all but one have beat expectations, and they've beat it pretty handedly. And what this screen will also show is what do we expect? What are we seeing about revisions for the next quarter? So we are also seeing revisions, estimates starting to be revised upward for out quarters. If I change this and show you the European market, also seeing the same, not as much of a beat in terms of the reported actuals of the companies that have reported, but you're still seeing most companies are beating expectations going on. Lastly, another good app to show how the impact the pandemic has impacted the market is the aggregates, our aggregates pages. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of the aggregates pages, right here I'm showing the pharmaceutical medical industry, and I'm doing the same, a year-to-date price change. If I look across the different regions of the world, almost every region has year-to-date price change in the pharmaceutical medical industry as being positive. Only Africa and Latin America were showing negative. And even if you look at the last 4 weeks, and the last 4 weeks is really a little bit after the rebound happened, we're still seeing an upward trend in prices in the pharmaceutical and medical industry. So it's something to show that there is positivity going on in this industry. What else you can see on the aggregates page here is I could put other metrics in. I could look at what's going on with revenue expectations. Are we seeing upward trends in revenue expectations? What's going on with earnings expectations? So definitely powerful tools that will help reiterate the thoughts that both Sanjeev and David just gave us.
That's great. Thanks very much, Sean. Appreciate that. Right, let's go on to our next topic, which I want to focus on vaccines. It's obviously a big talking point at the moment. And COVID-19 has, generated a rush to try and find a vaccine for this pandemic. Which healthcare companies are currently involved in the pipeline of activity? David, I'm going to pose that question to you first, just to outline your views in this regard.
Yeah, sure. So, I think Sean's going to show you, but there's well over 600 drugs that are currently being explored for COVID. So that's a lot. I'm going to focus on vaccines. There's only about 150 of those. So even within that space, there's a lot going on. I'm just going to try to focus a little bit on the front runners and some of the companies you may already have heard of. So there's really 3 that have advanced into the latest stage of development, which is phase 3 clinical trials. So you have collaborations, Pfizer, BioNTech, that's one, Moderna, and AstraZeneca and Oxford University are the last of those 3. So each of those companies has just launched phase 3 trials. They're recruiting about 30,000 patients that they need to demonstrate the effectiveness of the products. Those 3 are the front runners. They've all released some promising data. It is obviously too early to see how that's going to translate in phase 3. Typically industry success rates for phase 3 are relatively high because by the time companies get to that point, they want to be pretty sure the drug is going to work. But the timelines here have been very compressed. So, some of the mechanisms for these products are relatively novel. Some of these techniques haven't been used before in vaccines. So I do think we need to temper our expectations. It's really just too early to see. Coronaviruses have been studied in the past, which is good, and the body does generate a natural immune response that can be leveraged, like, for example, in HIV. So I think there is definitely promise, but the reality is we're moving very fast compared to what's happened in the past. So we just really need to sit back and see what's going to happen with the data. In addition to those 3 front runners, you've got some small players who really are only a few months back at this point and have generated a lot of excitement. Companies like Novavax, Inovio, and CureVac. Some of these companies have received funding from the U.S. government and other sources, but there's a lot more uncertainty around these players. There's definitely opportunity if the front runners fail or if there are supply shortages. There could be room for more than a couple of companies in this market. but they've released less data. They're smaller. They have fewer other programs to fall back on. And so if the front runners do succeed and if a working vaccine becomes available, it could become quite hard for them. Novavax is expected to announce some phase 2 data shortly. Things may become clearer. But for me, at least, these companies are just, it's a little bit more of a gamble what's going to go on there. In addition to those smaller players, there are some large players who are kind of later to the party. I'm thinking of companies like Merck, GSK, and Sanofi. These companies haven't yet entered clinical development stage, testing humans, even though they're some of the biggest, vaccine current manufacturers in the world. But they do have some significant advantages in terms of scale, in terms of the ability to leverage existing technologies. And it's hard to believe that they won't play some kind of a role going forward. So I think there's interest there. And again, because the timelines are so compressed, it may be that they may not be that far behind the other companies. And then there's a few minnows that have created a ton of buzz, like Vaxart, that has also received some funding, leading to a huge surge in valuation. But for me, those are a big gamble. And then finally, you have some Chinese companies like CanSino and Sinovac. They're also entering phase 3 trials, but not in the US. But obviously, with relative lack of transparency, I would have some kind of concerns about investing in those companies, just like I'd have concerns about the fact that Russia has just announced that they're about to, bring their trial to the market. So that's pretty much how I would categorize the major players in the vaccine space.
Thanks very much, David. And I think you alluded to it now. So, Sean, can you maybe just show us how these activities can be monitored in ICON then?
Sure. The powerful tool in ICON to monitor this, give me a second as I share my screen here, is what we call the Healthcare Intelligence app. This app is an app built in conjunction with Clarivate Cortellis. So it's the powerful drug data that Clarivate Cortellis can provide with the powerful financial data that is in the Refinitiv databases. So I can come into the Healthcare Intelligence app and I can search here by indication, I can search by drug, or I can search by a company. So right now I'm searched by the COVID-19 infection. And what you can see is that there are a huge amount of drugs that are tagged to COVID. We right now have 667 drugs that Clarivate Cortellis is telling us are tagged to the COVID-19 infection. And why that's happening really is that there are a large amount of drugs that are being used in the hospitals right now to treat patients. So they might have been some type of respiratory drug or a drug to treat some other type of infection that is now being used to treat COVID. Therefore, they're tagged as COVID. The other part of this is how many companies are trying to figure out or are in the discovery stage or in the trial stages of trying to see if they can figure out a vaccine. So there's a huge amount of companies throwing their hat into this ring, and all of those are being assigned to COVID-19. But what I can do here is I am able to dig in and get beyond just seeing 667 drugs. I can dig in and filter this data to find out where the opportunities are. There's a lot of other data also on this page, not just the drug names and the drug details, but I can dig in. One that I follow frequently is the press releases. I frequently look at the Food and Drug Administrative press releases that go out. It shows you what companies the Food and Drug Administration is talking about in terms of trials or any other data that's coming out there. So it's another tool I frequently use when I'm analyzing COVID-19 in the pharmaceutical sector. But if I look at the drugs, I can click and I can actually dig into all 667 drugs. But I'm going to go a step further, and I'm going to actually filter this data. And what I want to do is filter this data by, let me start with the phase 3 clinicals. And what I'm going to go is I'm going to go by mechanism, and I'm going to say I only want the ones that are the glycoprotein modulators and inhibitors, because those are the ones that we're seeing more that are in the news that are being talked about as vaccines that are really progressing. And here you get a lot of the companies that we're seeing being talked about as the major players in the vaccine space right now. So you get the AstraZeneca, the AZD1222, which is the Jenner Institute and AstraZeneca. You get the Moderna. You have the BioNTech. So all of these are the ones that are in phase 3. And I can dig into these further. So if I wanted to click on the AZD drug, I can click here, and now I actually get the drug institute, the drug details. So what companies are involved in it, where it is with the phase, is it there to treat anything else, anything about the drug. And then there's even more. So what are the drug names? So you might see these drug names in the news. What this will tell you is it all does refer back to this same drug. Anything to do with deals and patents. And as we get more information about the clinical trials data, that all will flow into this tool. The other part is to expand out. I can go into a little bit more detail by taking off just phase 3, and I can look at phase 2 also. So this is going to give me a little bit more of the companies that are in the pipeline, that are having that are in testing, and have drugs that are showing promise. And if I want to go, I can look at if I look at preclinical and discovery, that's where you get a lot more of those smaller players that are trying to throw their ideas out there, seeing if they can find something. So a very powerful tool. What this also does, this tool does, is it will link you from here into a lot more financial data of the company. Is I can link here from knowing that Pfizer is working on this vaccine. I can link now here to get more information on Pfizer, to read the research reports, to read the press releases, and hear what and see what the analysts and what's the market is saying about this drug. So powerful data from both Clarivate, Cortellis, and powerful data from Refinitiv in this space.
Great, thank you, Sean. I think it's good to see how the fundamentals and those, Cortellis, Clarivate data actually commingles in that app. Sanjeev, I want to finish off with you and actually just find out from you, what you're seeing, where the most activity in the vaccine industry is on your side.
Yeah, David have shown and sort of really covered the space well, and sort of I agree with all those observations. So maybe I'll just embellish a sort of few of those points. The first is sort of the activity is global, at least in terms of geographies and companies. It's worth mentioning, as an example, that vaccine development activity in China rivals that sort of that we're seeing in the US and the EU. But focusing on the West, the most amount of activity, at least that I see, is in this group of companies that are part of what we're calling Operation Warp Speed. And that's an initiative, a program sponsored by the US government to develop and potentially even start producing a vaccine by the end of this year. There are about 7 companies that are sort of being sponsored, and 4 of them, sort of we've mentioned, are in late stage or going to embark in late stage trials, which can be quite massive. And those are Moderna and sort of Pfizer BioNTech, and then AstraZeneca and Novavax. I think we'll sort of see the first data coming up shortly. Moderna, as David mentioned, is running a massive trial across the US, 30,000 patients. AstraZeneca, by contrast, is sort of running it in Brazil, UK, and EU. Some quite fascinating trial designs for AstraZeneca. I think in Europe, it could be quite a shortcut, sort of running vaccine challenge trials, which sort of is this notion that can volunteers and maybe inject half of them vaccine, sort of the virus, and the other half, and then sort of see if the vaccine works or not. I think they aimed for 5,000 to recruit 5,000 volunteers, and they got 25,000 a day. At least that's what I hear. So the timelines, I think, by the end of the year, November, December. But personally, I wouldn't be surprised if we see the first efficacy results. A lot has to be determined of safety, even by September or October, depending on a couple of things, which is how recruitment of volunteers go. And the second is the underlying rate of the COVID spread. So sort of that's sort of, the activity in the vaccine space, and I guess everybody's holding their breath for the first sort of data. There's a fair amount of activity too in sort of these, what is known as therapeutic antibodies, or passive immunity. That will be also towards the end of the year, sort of short-lived protection. The one area of incredible activity that sort of often we don't speak about because it's hidden in the background is this production. How do you produce vaccines? And here, there's some 7 billion people on the planet. The massive bottlenecks, they've been ironed out as we speak. And all of these sort of companies at Operation Warp Speed have pretty much sort of partnered. But there's a lot of activity going on there. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Sanjeev. Very insightful. Next, I actually want to turn to more forward-looking, questions, and we'll start off with what are the prospects that you think is playing out for the industry as a whole, and then also for the companies specifically involved in the development of vaccines. So, I think to anyone who doesn't have deep sector knowledge, one might assume that the pandemic would have a relatively positive impact on the sector, but is that really the case? What type of movement can we expect once a vaccine? So, Sean, I'd like to start off with you with this one, and just for you to show how to find the forward-looking view of the healthcare industry in ICON.
Sure. So let me hear. So it's a tough question to answer right now, because I think a lot of it goes back to what we just heard, in that there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how will a vaccine even be rolled out if and when one is approved. So how I would answer that question is how do you stay on top of the data? So what I do here is, this is an app called the Watchlist Pulse with an icon. And I have a watch list created of what I believe are the major players right now, and they've all come up here as we've talked, the major players right now that are in the vaccine space and are moving towards maybe having the vaccine that gets approved. And what I do is I keep them in the Watchlist Pulse, and what the Watchlist Pulse does is allows me to monitor them on a daily basis. The Pulse looks at movement and data in the past 24 hours, and it alerts me to data movements. So what I'll know is that I'll know if a company that I'm following here that is in the vaccine space, is there some new research on there that I want to read? Is there some rec changes in an analyst note that talks about the rec change and why? Do they have any new events coming up that I might want to attend that discuss the possibilities of a vaccine? And that's what this Watchlist Pulse is going to do. It's going to keep me on top of the information that's out there, that's going to help me make these decisions about what to expect in the future. Because it all comes down to, right now, there's lots of questions about how a vaccine would be distributed, how the price of the vaccine would go out to people that are getting it, and how would it be paid for. So all those questions are going to end up impacting any type of investment, and they're very much unknown right now. But what ICON does, it gives you the tools to be able to stay on top of the information. So all of these here, it gives, as I look here, I can expand these all out, and it actually gives me what did go on in the last 24 hours. So if I look at Sanofi, it's telling me here are the research reports published in the last 24 hours on the company, and I can easily from here and go and read them. There's an investor event coming up, and I can add this to my calendar or attend the event this way. And here are the filings. So I can tailor this page to what I think is meaningful that I want to track, but powerful ways to follow the companies that are in the vaccine space right now without having to dig into each one separately each day. This is going to tell me exactly which companies have movement and have data revisions and have meaningful data that I might want to dig into more. The other app that I'll show is going back to one I showed at the beginning, and that's the earnings season app. And so I very frequently go to the earnings season app just because it's a powerful app to show the trends in what's going on in the certain marketplace. I actually just have the S&P 500 up, in healthcare is part of it. And what you see here is that we're seeing a huge amount of beats, of earnings beats in these spaces across the S&P 500. 92% of the healthcare industry is beating expectations at the start of this earnings season right now. Overall, we're seeing a huge amount in the whole marketplace, 80%, which is yes, there's more than usually more than 50% of companies beat expectations. That's just the nature of how estimates works, but we're never up around 80%. 80% is definitely abnormal. And it's just showing that what was thought about in March as the impacts to these companies was a little bit overblown, and we are seeing results a little bit better than what expectations were. But I can now use this page going forward to track exactly what is going on in this industry and see what companies are beating expectations and why. And I can read into that and follow where there might be investment opportunities.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. Sanjeev, I'm gonna go back to you, and I'm gonna ask for your view, please, on the future prospects of the industry.
Okay, yeah. So I'll try and keep it sort of more general, and then maybe David would speak about sort of the vaccines and sort of other sectors. So my own view is sort of the pandemic will have quite a positive impact on the prospects of across the sector. There are, of course, some hard-hit ones, but sort of they're also recovering. Maybe the hospitals take much longer. And let me keep the sort of question about the longer-term economic impacts aside. There's certainly sort of unknowns there, and sort of, at least to me, it's unclear. The questions about sort of unemployment and insurance and pricing. And then, future returns to me sort of will depend in some part on the length and depth of sort of the COVID crisis. That's one. And then the timely success, I suppose, of a vaccine is a second. As one base case, I've sort of assumed that COVID will become endemic, potentially seasonal, perhaps sort of a declining virulence with time, just making comparisons across history and sort of the biology. And then I'll sort of be bold and say that I'd expect the vaccines were first. These are all new technologies, so much to learn. But broadly speaking, they would be sort of effective and safe, and maybe sort of even hit the timelines that sort of have been set out. And so, under that scenario, a few major themes emerge for the sort of prospects, and let me sort of at a high level speak to them. The ones I find attractive. The first one is, I think, companies involved in telemedicine. I think there's been a structural shift in physician and patient behavior to adopt telemedicine, and there are all sorts of technologies involved here. But I think the shift is likely stick and survive the end of the COVID crisis. The next is sort of companies involved in bioproduction. Sort of we spoke earlier, there's significant bottlenecks, but the amount of capacity that's needed is just massive. And I think some of those investments are likely to pay off. And it's not just the sort of the incremental jump from vaccines, it's sort of beyond that. As we look in the distance, innovations in biologics, and then even beyond that, sort of new areas of cell and gene therapy. So capacity has been built out across the world, and right now there's an extreme shortage. The third area sort of that I find the prospects fascinating are sort of companies, that I sort of bucketed on the life science tools, but they're companies that supply the technology for basic science discovery and drug discovery. These include genomics and structural biology and even machine learning. To my mind, there's an ongoing explosion of activity in the space that is feeding scientific and clinical applications, and just maybe the start of a sort of multi-decade sort of explosion in innovation. And then, there's biotechnology. I think, obviously sort of the innovations as we've seen it in vaccines, but it just goes beyond that from many of these basic science advances. And then maybe a few sort of supporting things. Arguably political risk, at least in the near and midterm, on sort of pricing and elections in the US is always a big deal. Has been somewhat diminished, and the sector has been in a 5-year historical low in terms of valuation. I think there's sort of a fair amount of M&A consolidation awaits us over the next few years. A lot of cash sort of sitting with some of the larger companies. And then, potentially biotech is the beneficiary of sort of this long-term US-China tech race. And then finally, I'll touch on some pockets of medical device that we've seen. It's not from the pandemic per se, but secular themes that sort of have been running and sort of long way to go still. Some of the device innovations in diabetes, in cardiology, and then some of the innovations around robotic surgery. So let me just sort of stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. David, I want to move on to you now for this question, and maybe if you could give your more specific view around the vaccines, that would be good.
Yeah, sure. So I agree with Sanjeev. I think he touched on many points that demonstrate how the prospects for the industry as a whole are actually relatively promising, except, my only concern again is the overall economic impact and, access and government willing to pay and so on. But other than that, I think many of the trends are very positive. Thinking about vaccine companies specifically, so, among some of the ones that I mentioned earlier, there's obviously there's no question that there could be a huge market for a COVID vaccine, and that's what's kind of really driven up the valuations of some of these companies. I think they are looking at a price of around $40 per course in the developed world. So right there, if that seems to be kind of the price point at least Moderna and Pfizer are looking at, although it seems like AstraZeneca might be offering it more at a kind of cost-based price to European governments. But still, if you take that at face value, you're looking at a market of $40 billion plus in the developed world alone, which would kind of roughly double the size of the current global vaccine market. So that's obviously a substantial opportunity. We don't know yet if that's going to be recurring, but obviously many people believe that it may be. I think we heard from today, I think the CEO of AstraZeneca mentioned that this could be a product that you need to get annually. So that could be some kind of annual stream, or that you could require some periodic booster shots. But even if that's only a possibility, that obviously the financial rewards could be very large. So it's not surprising that we're seeing quite a bit of movement in the sector because the expectations are so great. For me, really, the question is the kind of the run up in prices that we've seen at some of these companies commensurate with the size of that opportunity? You look at Moderna, I think it's valued at something like $30 billion. And when you add up the value of some of these COVID stocks that I mentioned earlier, you're looking at a total run-up in value of about 80 to 100 billion, just based on kind of eyeballing without doing any rigorous analysis. So you've got a run-up of this kind of 80 to 100 billion dollars in value, and you've got a potential market of, in the region of $40 billion. So it doesn't seem like it's way off whack. It's just that you have to think about the question of the possibility of failure. I mentioned earlier on that obviously we have a lot of companies looking at this kind of spike protein. Is that going to work? Is it not going to work? There's obviously always the risk of failure. So I think that the potential is huge. The prospects are good. In some respects, maybe the valuations aren't unreasonable, but you've got to believe that you kind of have these relatively high prices and this kind of recurring revenue stream, I believe, and a relatively high chance of success to, I think, justify some of the valuations. But obviously, we just have to wait and see what the data shows before we can really make any judgment about whether it's all justified.
Great. Thanks very much, David. I'm actually going to go to some of the questions from the audience now, so that we've got some time to go through that. So the first question, thoughts on biotechs embellishing their results to boost their stock price to, number one, for insider profits, and number two, raise further capital. Sanjeev, David, do any of you have thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment on insider profits. But I have been working in the industry advising large and small companies for a long time, doing a lot of valuation work. And one thing that we always see is that management is going to show the best results that they can, right? So no one's, in my experience, no one's making anything up. And I wouldn't say that anyone's necessarily embellishing anything, but obviously they're always going to put their best foot forward. So I think you do need to be careful, especially with, maybe the smaller companies where there's only, maybe if they only have the one asset or a couple of assets, and it really means everything to the company, they're always going to be putting their best foot forward. So I think you definitely, need to bear that in mind when you're looking at some of the results. Of all these companies, that every CEO of a small biotech company believes that their product is the best one, but not everybody can be the winner.
Yeah, let me sort of concur with all of that. I guess I've been in the space long enough, and I can vouch that, small biotechs at least, quite a dangerous sector. Results are always embellished, and this is not just the small companies, but even the larger ones. And one example here is just the journals, the number of sort of articles that are out. Obviously, all of them choose to highlight some of the more positive things because, the correlates of protection are sort of known, but not entirely, right? There's an ongoing big dialogue about neutralizing antibodies, but then the role of these things, separate arm of the immune system called T cells, and everybody will highlight sort of what really works. So that's entirely true. It's not a space for the faint-hearted. Some of the smaller biotechs are highly volatile, and then it's sort of hard to say how things play out. That's one part. The insider, and we've obviously seen a lot of commentary on sort of Moderna. I just heard, in fact, this morning, somebody was telling me that, but anyway, let me not get into that. That, I think, has been consistent, and I don't know if I put too much stock into it. For many executives, this has been sort of the singular sort of value they're creating, and I have at least seen it consistently, the sort of insider selling for things that work out really brilliantly in the end, too. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's sort of correlated, but that's just my personal view across history. Anyway, I'll stop there then.
Okay. Your views, Sanjeev and David.
Pranita, quickly on. Srini, I was going to say quickly on that.
Sure.
To follow up on things that are in our product that users can use to help answer that question also is, one, we have an earnings quality model that we run through our StarMind analytics team, looking at abnormalities in what companies do for earnings releases, and we give them a score over time, and are they consistently putting in trying to, I guess, in a sense, embellish their numbers. So that earnings quality model can be pretty powerful because it allows you to compare companies as to how they're scoring in our model. We also have an insider model showing doing some insider ownership. And then we do have pages that track insider ownership and insider sales. So definitely that data and those tools are within the ICON product, and the information's there to analyze and help make those decisions and decide, do you think a company is embellishing, and will it eventually catch up to them?
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for that addition. Moving on to our next question. This audience member basically states that we have never made a successful vaccine for a coronavirus. Is it possible that with the advances in technology over the recent years that we've seen, and the global focus and also the unlimited funding, that we could get a COVID vaccine, or is it more likely that we will need effective therapeutics?
Yeah, well, maybe I can start and then hand it sort of to David. That's a sort of good one, right? So that's certainly true. In fact, there's so many viruses, and especially some of the pulmonary ones, RSV, that sort of have been failure. But I will say this, and I'll just sort of take a shot at it. That in this specific case, I think it's more a question of biology that gives me a little bit confidence rather than effort. obviously the effort to speeden up things and massively fund everything and get things in gear is critical. But the biology, the virus itself, right? So some of the mutations and the strains are all seemingly susceptible to this sort of neutralizing antibodies. I think we've seen now the initial data in humans in the first sort of phase 1s and 2s, and then more importantly, some of the data in animals. Some of the macaque monkey models are quite predictive. So I think it's a question of sort of biology, right? So it hasn't yet mutated to this. I'll get a little bit sort of technical. There's specific attachments of sort of this virus spike versus the receptors, across the human body, but in the lung, and that connection seems to be the most vital. And if you can interrupt that, you can reliably see some effect. So it's the biology and sort of less about the effort that sort of gives me a little more confident. Of course, the first generation vaccines are unknown in terms of long-term safety. But anyway, so let me just stop there.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would agree in terms of, the biology, as I mentioned earlier, that the body does seem to generate this natural immune response. So if that can be harnessed, then I think there's a good opportunity. I think we also have relatively new technologies that have become available. Some of the technologies in terms of kind of replicating that spike protein in the body so that it generates the immune response, I think are relatively new, that maybe weren't around, when, we had the original SARS epidemic, when however long ago that was. And I think some of the experience, the knowledge that we gained from that, and in addition with the new technology and the rapidity with which the genetic sequences have been released and people were able to start working on it, plus the funding, overall, I think that we are relatively hopeful that actually, this is going to happen. And so obviously, we have to wait and see the results. But my perspective is I am relatively hopeful about this particular vaccine.
Great, that's encouraging to hear. Right, so I'm gonna ask Sanjeev and David specifically a little bit for you to stick out your neck and ask you which firms in general you expect will emerge as a winning investment opportunity from the pandemic. And Sanjeev, I'll give the floor to you first.
Okay. It's actually going to be tough for me to specify particular firms. That's only because my compliance function is always looking over my shoulder. So let me just sort of, but I'll sort of start off by saying, at least let's if I think about the short term, right? And then there's many of these sort of companies, especially in the med device areas, that have been hard hit. Especially with sort of the virus or the vaccine, and they're probably going to see a reversal. I think sort of the hospitals in the U.S. have set aside procedures and precautions that are sort of tailored for this, and the pent-up demand is massive. So that sort of recovery, I would think, is kind of on the cards for some of these companies, that is, especially in the elective procedures that have been hit. In the longer term, I'll just go back to the themes that we've sort of touched on. Structurally, I think let me just keep aside the valuations, and maybe there's a time for sort of when the dust settles on sort of the vaccines, that there's a long-term shift in sort of telemedicine, I think is a great area. Long-term bioproduction, often an overlooked area, but pretty much sort of the backbone of the industry. Basic discovery, to my mind, is sort of fueling some innovation that at least I see for sort of a few generations, just for biology. And then sort of there's biotech. I think we see a wave of consolidation, especially companies in sort of late-stage oncology and autoimmune diseases. That are sort of two areas that larger companies are incredibly focused on, in some part because of sort of the pricing and the returns you get from that. And then there are these, specific trends in medical devices they've been here before, but they're just sort of still taking off. And that is some of the devices that we see in diabetes. There's some of the that you see in cardiology, sort of structural heart. And then sort of, robotic surgery. So these sort of markets have very long road ahead if you're a sort of long-term investor.
Right. Steve, I appreciate you answering that. David, over to you, maybe for your expectations on this as well.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Sanjeev said, and I think he's spot on as you think about the general sectors that I think will do well going forward. I guess talking specifically about some of these vaccine manufacturers' investment opportunities. I think it's obviously such a dynamic area, and you have to look very carefully at the expectations that are already built into the valuations. Some of these valuations are changing very fast. But I would be pretty nervous about the run-up in valuations for some of the smaller players that I mentioned, like Novavax, Inovio, Vaxart. We've seen these kind of huge run-ups in value, and I think they are there's a lot of risk there, and I probably would gamble on those personally. The Moderna is an interesting one again, but this is one where I feel like the valuation is now so high that I think a lot of things just need to go right to justify those kinds of valuations. That you have this kind of high chance of success, which we're positive about it, but still you need to assume a high chance of success. You need to assume that you're going to get that $40 to $50 price point in the developed world. You kind of need to assume that you're getting a recurring revenue stream, you're getting a decent slice of the pie. So none of this is unreasonable, but still this kind of also looks to me like a bit of a gamble. You just need to assume that a lot of things are going to go right. So if I were going to really pick some winners, I'd probably go with the other front runners out of the three that I mentioned. But again, obviously this market is evolving very quickly. New data is emerging the whole time. So it's definitely not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, maybe I'll add sort of a little bit to that, sort of very, very briefly, and really stick my neck out. So the first wave of the vaccines, these 4 companies, I think broadly hard to make out. But if I am going to take a sort of vaccine, but I am particularly intrigued, and I'll leave aside valuations for now. We're going to see the protein subunit vaccines. This company, Novavax, will have sort of phase 1 data out. And if I assume that we're going to take it repeatedly, maybe seasonally, at least for sort of maybe a couple of more years, I think that's a sort of, and you have to take a booster. The safety is a little bit sort of more reliable for me, and that's something I would sort of prioritize. Then maybe the mRNA sort of vaccines, Moderna and BioNTech. And Astra has shown some wonderful data, but sort of I have a question about sort of longer term or booster, given the nature of these sort of vector viruses where you get immunity against the vaccine itself. So that's to the extent I suppose I could stick my neck out.
Thank you very much, Sanjeev, and to David. I think we've unfortunately reached the top of the hour, so we've just gone over time, so we have to cut it there. I'd like to say thank you very much to our panelists once again for joining us and taking the time out to speak to us, and again to all the audience members who also joined and listened. I think we had a very good discussion on a topic that unfortunately can sometimes be a little bit morbid. But still a very good discussion. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll hope to see you back on one of our webinars again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks much.